presentations. The title will be After War Ends, the Political Economy of Post-Conflict Violence in Indonesia. So let me read you a brief biography of Patrick. He is the current PhD candidate in the Department of Politics, University of Oxford. He has previous degrees from the University of Edinburgh and Harvard University. For 7 years, he managed the World Bank's conflict program in Indonesia, including the bank's support to Aceh peace process. He has published widely, including articles in World Development, Journal of Political Economy, Journal of East Asian Studies, and St. Anthony's International Review, as well as numerous book chapters and policy papers. His book on local conflict and community development in Indonesia was published by Yale University Press this year. He has also been a contributor to the 2011 World Development Report on Conflict, Security and Development, and acts as an advisor to OSAID, the World Bank and the Asian Foundation. So, we have worked with Patrick previous years back in 2005 and in 2006 on the moving out of poverty study. So now I think I will let Patrick talk for about 1 hour and we have a discussion afterwards.
Thanks, Kiki, and thank you everyone. Thank you everyone for coming this morning. This is actually a great opportunity for me because today I'm going to present on my PhD thesis work, which is almost finished, inshallah. And this is actually a good chance for me to rehearse some of this and get some feedback as I try to finish. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about the political economy of post-conflict violence in Indonesia. What do I mean by that? What I mean is I want to look at places in Indonesia that had large-scale violence before. Many of you will remember the early years after Suharto fell. A number of areas of Indonesia had large-scale civil war or intercommunal violence. All of those areas, the violence came to an end. They had peace agreements or security responses that lowered levels of violence. But in a lot of these places, there's still incidents of smaller-scale violence continuing. And so today I'm going to try and come up with an explanation for that. So I want to start by taking us back about 1.5 years ago to Ambon, the capital of Maluku province. Some of you might remember this. In September 2011, suddenly riots broke out in Ambon. And the initial cause was an ojek driver, a motorcycle taxi driver, was found dead under suspicious circumstances. Now, his bike was crashed, and the road where he crashed, there was often motorbike accidents there. It had been a rainy night as well. But there seemed to be some suspicious circumstances. For example, when his body was returned to his family, there appeared to be a stab wound in the back of his head. His motorcycle was not actually damaged that much, and yet his helmet was full of blood. And rumours started to circulate that actually maybe he had been killed by the Christians. Maybe this was the Christians trying to exact revenge to this Muslim man. The next day was his funeral, and after the mourning it erupted into a riot. There was a group of hundreds there, and before we knew it, the violence had started to spread across Ambon. There were attacks on various communities and houses, and within 3 days, 8 people had died, 200 were injured, and over 3,000 people were displaced. As you know, violence is not new to Ambon or Maluku. From 1999 until 2002, there was very vicious inter-religious violence between Christians and Muslims there, which resulted in about 2,800 deaths. But this was new violence in Maluku. And it didn't appear that this was just communal passions, that this was just hatred between different ethnic or religious groups. But there seemed to be some political and economic interests at play here. Local elites and government in the province had been under pressure because of corruption investigations from KPK. There were many Kreman groups active in Ambon, and strangely the police and the military had actually withdrawn troops from Ambon just the day before, or a couple of days before the riot happened. What's going on here? And so this is the topic of my presentation today. Why do these incidents of post-conflict violence occur? So Today I'm going to just give you a little bit of context and outline 3 different research questions, 3 puzzles that I seek to answer. Give a little bit on my methodology, my approach, and then use some evidence from Indonesia, in particular from 3 provinces where I've done in-depth fieldwork in Maluku, Utara, and Aceh. And then finally look at a little bit more at the national level, what's been going on in Jakarta. Okay. So as I said earlier, there was a lot of violence in the early days after Suharto fell. And we can divide that violence into what I call episodic violence and extended violence. Now the difference is that extended violence has very large impacts and continues over long periods of time. Essentially we're talking about local wars here. You had civil wars in Aceh and in East Timor. And then you had inter-religious or inter-ethnic communal violence in 5 other provinces, Maluku, Utara, Sulawesi, and 2 provinces in Borneo as well. However, at the same time, there was a rise in episodic violence. Episodic violence is violence that's short-lived, maybe it just lasts for a day or 2 and then it burns out. And that took the form of both smaller scale and larger scale episodic violence. So in terms of smaller scale violence, there was a rise in things like lynchings. Maybe many of you will remember the killings of ninjas in Banyuwangi in Jawa Timur. Also a lot of popular justice killings, rises in violent crime. And this went on throughout Indonesia. In addition, we had large-scale episodic violence, riots, group clashes. The largest of these were obviously in Jakarta, but also in many other cities as well. So all these types of violence going on in the early post-Suharto year. And collectively, these have very large impacts. This is some data on the 6 provinces that had extended violent conflicts, using data from the National Violence Monitoring System, which will introduce later on. And overall, about 18,000 people died in these conflicts. Most of them from about 1999 to 2002 or so. In all areas, conflict came to an end. So, as you can see from the period of extended violence here, in all places, there was either a peace agreement in Central Sulawesi, Maluku, and Aceh. In West Kalimantan and Central Kalimantan, all the Madaris were forced out, and that ended the violence. In North Maluku, they declared civil emergency, and North Maluku, they declared civil emergency, and that ended the violence there in mid-2000. However, even though all the large-scale violence has come to an end, there's a lot of variation between these provinces in the levels of post-conflict violence, the violence after the large-scale violence ended. And this table here shows the number of deaths since the end of the large-scale violence by province. And you can see the largest number is actually in West Kalimantan. However, that's a function of the provincial population being large there. I think there's about 4.5 million people live there. And also because the extended violence ended quite early there in 1999. If we start to look at per capita impacts per year, you see that one or 2 provinces stand out. Maluku and Central Sulawesi. They have far more people killed per year than the other provinces. In contrast, North Maluku has been relatively peaceful. Relatively, not completely peaceful, but if you compare with Maluku or Sulawesi, it's done a lot better, and the other provinces are somewhere in the middle. Not only is the level of violence does it vary between provinces, but also the types of violence disappear as well. So here I divide between large episodic violence and small episodic violence. Now I define this as incidents where 3 or more people were killed, where there was 10 or more injuries, or where 15 or more buildings were damaged. If that happened, I define it as a large incident. If it was less, the impacts were less than that, it's a small incident. And as you can see that Maluku still has the highest for both large and small, but actually some of the other provinces vary in the types of violence they've had. So for example, Aceh, which had a middle level of overall violence, actually has very small numbers of large incidents and higher numbers of small incidents. can also see that overall there has been a big decline in the number of deaths from violence, and this is largely attributable to the end of these extended violent conflicts. The blue shaded area is data from 15 provinces, about half of Indonesia. The orange brown is Aceh. And what you can see is basically from 2001, 2002, the levels of violence started to decrease. This was as all the intercommunal violent conflicts came to an end. And then there was a very sharp decrease from about 2005, which is when the civil war in Aceh came to an end. Okay, so that's a lot of data. You know what's actually interesting there? And I think there's three different questions here that are interesting, which I'm going to try and contribute answers to. First is, why do some areas see more post-conflict violence than others? Remember, Maluku had a lot of post-conflict violence, whereas North Maluku very little. Why are those areas different? Secondly, why does post-conflict violence take different forms in different areas? In Maluku, you still have large riots, group clashes. In Aceh, you still have a lot of violence, but it's smaller scale stuff. It's violent crime, it's things where maybe one or two people get injured. It's not these large outbursts of violence. So why large violence in some areas and small in others? And then why has there been no return to extended violence anywhere? So this has gone down, and there's a lot of violence in Ambon, but it's nothing like 1999 or 2000. Why has Indonesia been successful in stopping these areas, extended violence from there out? Yep.
Yeah, about that picture that you showed.
Yep.
So is that blue part? That includes the red part?
Yeah.
So in 2003 it was all the violence was basically in Aceh.
That's right. So from 2002 until 2004, you see there's actually not that much going on apart from Aceh. That's because there was peace agreements or peace settlements in all of these other large-scale conflict areas.
So, but when the events went down in Aceh, the events in other places went up. Is that how I can read this?
I'm not going to talk about this. This is the subject of another presentation, which is essentially there's been a rise in smaller scale violence across Indonesia. Many of this is in provinces that are not post-conflict areas that didn't have large-scale violence before. So, I mean, you see in the newspapers every day that the stuff in Lampung, in Tarakan, and in many places there's been a rise in violence. So, that's a very interesting question, but I won't focus on that. Maybe in the questions at the end we can have a chat about that. Okay, so my basic research approach was to use mixed methods. The data I've presented so far is from something called the National Violence Monitoring System, which was a project started at the World Bank many years ago when I was still there, which essentially uses incidents of violence reported in local newspapers. They're clipped, they're coded, they're assigned by what was the type, what was the form of violence, what were the impacts, where did it take place. And I've used that data set to map out these spatial patterns. Overall, the data set has over 150,000 incidents in it. It's actually the largest single country conflict data set anywhere in the world. The National Violence Monitoring System is now being taken on by Menko Kesra, and a number of NGOs and other groups are also involved, hopefully SMERU in the future as well. I then used this data and the observed spatial variation to select 3 provinces that varied in patterns of post-conflict violence. So 3 places that all had large-scale extended violence before, but then have different patterns of post-conflict violence. And the provinces I chose are Maluku, North Maluku, and Aceh. And I did field work in those areas, about 300 interviews or so in those places. Okay, so what's my basic argument? Let me start with my basic argument, which is a little bit theoretical, and then I'll turn to the Indonesian materials to show how this plays out. First, post-conflict violence is not primarily a result of societal hatreds or of a weak state. You don't see more violence in Maluku than North Maluku because Christians hate Muslims more, or Muslims hate Christians more, or because the local state is weaker. Rather, the variance in post-conflict violence is driven by the levels of support for violence by three different sets of actors. The first is local elites. By that I mean local politicians, but also local informal elites, religious leaders, ADAP leaders, and so on. Second group is what I call local violence specialists. Essentially what we're talking about here are prey men and ex-combatants. Every society has different groups who have a propensity to use violence. And I'm drawing on the literature from Charles Tilly and others that call these local violence specialists. And the third group is national state elites. Politicians, military leaders, security chiefs at the center in Jakarta. And essentially I argue that different forms of violence are driven by different actors. This here shows schematically my argument. So essentially what I'm saying is different combinations of these three groups lead to different types of violence. Where you have no groups supporting violence, neither violence specialists, local elites, or central state elites, you tend to have very little violence. It's pretty obvious, right? Where you have local violence specialists using or supporting violence, but you don't have local elites or the central state supporting violence, violence will occur, but it will normally be small. For violence to escalate to larger episodic violence, you normally need the support of local elites. So that's what defines the difference between small scale and large scale. The areas where you have large scale violence, you not only have local violence specialists supporting violence, but you also have members of the local elite. For violence to escalate into extended violence of the type we saw in the early post-Suharto years, post-transition years, I argue that you also need support from central state elites. And I will show how this plays out in Indonesia later. Why would different groups support the use of violence? This is why I've entitled my talk Political Economy of Violence. I argue that most of the time, violence is used for instrumental purposes. It's used to try and get something. People are not using it just out of fear, or enemy, or frustration, but because violence can actually be profitable for them, economically or politically. And I argue there's three different variables which affect the incentives groups have to use violence. The first is the expected gains of using violence. Is it going to be beneficial? By burning down a house, am I going to get something that I want? The second is the risk of negative outcomes of using violence. Is there a risk that I will get arrested, or killed, or injured? The third is the availability of peaceful means. Okay, so maybe violence might be profitable, but are there other ways that I can get ahead which don't involve the same risk as using violence? Can I get a job? Can I have access to control of government contracts? Are there other peaceful ways that I can get ahead without using violence? And variation in these three sets of factors explain why different groups support violence or not. Now, why is violence used so instrumentally? And I argue in places like Indonesia, it's because rents and positions are so important. Indonesia is a democracy, but it's a patronage democracy in many ways. Access to power and resources is dependent on who you know, what group you're part of. And that means that often it's very difficult to compete peacefully. That basically the cost of losing out politically can be quite high in these types of situations. And that raises the propensity of people to use violence. In trying to understand the benefits and the costs of violence as well, I argue there's a very important mechanism here, which is signaling of responses to violence. Where violence is shown to pay, in other words, where groups use violence and then authorities reward it by succumbing to threats, by maybe you have a Bremen group saying, look, I want to get a project here. If the state actually says, okay, you can get that project after they use or threaten violence, that has a signaling effect, whereby people start to see, hey, you know, violence can be a good way of getting things, and that can have a kind of roll-on effect where other groups start to use violence as well. I argue as well that there will be differences in violence over time, at key points when these incentives to use violence increase. And I think there's 3 different times when this is the case. The first is when levels of resources, of government resources, are about to increase. And as I'll show later, there's been a spike in violence whenever special government post-conflict money, impress funds, have been about to arrive. Groups have used violence to try and get a share of that. The second is when levels of resources are about to decrease sharply. So maybe a group has been doing very well from projects, but then suddenly there's not going to be the same amount of money there. They can use violence to try and send a signal, look, we still want to get some of the pie. And the third is expected changes to the rules of the game. And I think there's 2 different things in the Indonesian situation going on here. One is corruption investigations. So when there's been investigations of corruption, when the rules of the game about what's acceptable behaviour with regards to the management of state funds are going to change, groups use violence to try and stop that. The other has been as Indonesia's democratic transition has evolved, the rules of the game changed, and I'll discuss that a bit later. So let's get into the Indonesian materials. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to skip through these reasonably quickly because I'm trying to cover a lot. But so if anything's not clear, I can take questions or we can have discussion at the end. So Maluku, as I showed earlier, Maluku has high levels of both large and small episodic violence. You can see it's high for both large episodic violence and small episodic violence. And what the theory would predict is that we would be able to observe support for violence from both local elites and local violence specialists. Remember, when you have these groups supporting violence, you have large and small-scale episodic violence. We also would predict that both groups would use violence for instrumental purposes, because it's beneficial and it's risk-free. We would also predict that there would be few other peaceful opportunities for accumulation in these areas. And remember, I discussed the temporal variation. We would expect that there would be a rise in violence when there were changes in the resources or to the rules of the game. Okay, so that's what the theory says. What's actually happening in local elites do support violence in Maluku. And the first reason is because it's beneficial and it's non-costly. Now let me just try and give a little bit of historical background on why this might be the case. The Molino Agreement in January 2002 led to the end of the conflict there. And a large part of the negotiations were essentially getting promises from central government to spend extra reconstruction money in Maluku. And this resulted in, first of all, civil emergency money, and then in about 2.2 trillion rupiah of extra post-conflict funds. This was special impress money that went to Maluku to rebuild houses, to repatriate Pengungsi, to have peace-building programs and so on. And essentially, local elites started to use this money for 2 purposes. One was to try and co-opt different groups who didn't support the peace agreement. So there were various radicals, in particular on the Muslim side in the early period, who didn't agree with the peace process. There's a group called the Team of 11 that was formed that had members from FKP, Laskar Jihad and others, who went to Jakarta to petition the president to say, look, this is not good for the Muslims, we still want to have jihad here, and so on. And essentially, these funds here were used to pay off a lot of that group. One of the famous examples is a guy called Muhammad Atamimi, who was a lecturer at the Islamic University there, who made very strong pronouncements. That peace this peace is illegitimate. We Muslims are going to keep fighting and so on. His opinion soon changed. He was appointed to be, I think, rector of the university there, or dean of the university, I forget. He eventually became head of the local Dinas Agama in the province. His university was given lots of funds to rehabilitate and so on, and his view changed. And this happened with many local elites. At the same time, local elites used the money to enrich themselves. There was vast corruption. There was a new house built for the governor, even though his house was not actually affected by the conflict. There was new messes built for the military and police. There was a lot of skimming of infrastructure contracts as well. And what soon started to happen was essentially groups saying, there's all this money, we're going to start using violence as a way to make sure that we get a part of this. And this basically developed a dynamic where all kinds of groups, politicians and so on, were using Preman group, ex-militia, to have violent protests and so on to make sure that they got some funds. At the same time, there was little risk of using violence. And the main reason was that the local security agencies were allowing this to occur. Now, what we had during the conflict, and this is true of all Indonesia's conflict areas, you had extra non-organic troops, BKO, came from Jakarta, from Makassar, from Surabaya, were stationed in the province, got very high salaries. They also managed to get many economic opportunities there, both legal and illegal. And basically, the presence of violence there legitimized their claims that we need lots of troops there. We shouldn't go back, we should stay there. And so there's quite a lot of evidence of the military and police at the local level of actually working with different militia, some of the Christian militia groups like Choker and Agas and others, to basically ensure that violence continues. And what's basically happened is that violence has become a currency of local politics in Ambon and Maluku. And you can see this through quite a lot of incidents, which I don't have time to outline, but there's been quite a few cases of corruption investigations where essentially just before KPK is going to arrive, there's been a riot, or there's been there's been rumours spread that there's going to be a riot. One of the biggest cases was in Lekwaro, which is the capital, which is a village in Masohi, the capital of Maluku on Asaram. And there was investigations in 2005 or 2006, I think, so 2008, where essentially there had been skimming of health and education projects. KPK was going to arrive. The village of Lekwaro was burnt down. KPK cancelled their visit. The governor made warnings. It's not safe to come here at the moment. This is going to stir things up too much. You should step back. And KPK did not go. There's a number of cases like this of violence basically being used as a currency of local politics. Also to prevent the withdrawal of military BKO troops. And there's still over 1,000 non-organic troops in Maluku. Just before there was a plan to pull them out, just before that happened, there were the riots, 2004 riots, which resulted in almost 40 people being killed in The other part of the argument is not just about the costs and benefits, but about other peaceful options. And basically I argue that local elites don't have many other ways of getting ahead. The main reason is that violence is still a zero-sum, politics is still a zero-sum game in Maluku. You do not have collaboration between Muslims and Christians. Now, there's one caveat to that, which is that local executive elections at Pilkadas, there are almost always joint tickets where the head is a Muslim or a Christian and the deputy is the other one, right? This is used because they need to win support to get elected. However, as soon as they're elected, what you essentially have is that the wakil and the head do not work together. They just try and divide up the projects themselves, and many times they actually, it's bad news. It just stops working halfway through. They don't stand again. This obsession in Maluku with religious balancing in the bureaucracy, at the university, or if you have so many deans are Muslim, there needs to be so many deans Christian, and there's so many heads of dinas is Muslim and Christian. And this really means that it's very difficult for elites to collaborate politically in peaceful ways. So what about these local violence specialists? Okay, so local elites want violence to happen, but they can't do it themselves. You don't find a local politician in Maluku as the guy actually going and setting a house on fire. They use local groups. And basically, local violence specialists in Morocco also have an interest in keeping violence going. The first reason is the dynamic I outlined before, where basically funds were used to try and co-opt these spoilers, these prey-man groups, these militias, and this has led to organisational continuity on the part of these local criminal gangs. So you still have a lot of the militia groups from 1999 to 2002 are still active there, and they still have links to the politicians there as well. Elites find such groups to be in their interests when they want to have a protest, when they want to use the threat of violence to stop corruption investigations. It's quite useful having these different groups there. And also communities often support these groups as well. The main reason is because often they're scared, right? It's useful having these gangs around to try and protect them. However, the main reason is for this continuing fear is because of elite actions. It's been in the interest of local elites to keep Christians and Muslims divided because it keeps our support bases strong at election time. And what you see is even Ambon is still very, very divided. You can draw a map, this is the Christian area, this is the Muslim area, and that's true in many areas of Morocco. And this kind of segregation leads to fear, which then leads local communities to turn to groups of prey man and young men to provide protection. Likewise, there's very few peaceful opportunities for young men in Ambon to get ahead. The economic growth there is below the national average. There's been vast urbanization going on there. There's a lot of unemployed young men and so on. So there are not many opportunities for groups to use peaceful means to get ahead. You remember before I said that violence was likely to increase at times when resources changed or when there were challenges to the rules of the game. And this graph here hopefully shows this dynamic. 2002 was when the Millennium Peace Accord was signed. That year there were still a lot of violent incidents going on. This was before a lot of these groups had been co-opted, right? You still got a lot of groups, Christian and Muslim, planting bombs, doing attacks on other faith communities and so on. By 2003, you had a lot of these groups had been co-opted. They'd been given money, they'd been given jobs, they'd been given projects. That managed to lower the level of violence. However, in 2004, this was mainly from civil emergency money. In 2004, the Impress post-conflict funds were announced, and they came on stream in 2005. What you see is a large spike in violence as local groups start to use violence as a way to try and stake a claim for projects, for jobs from that money. 2005 and 2006, 2007 are relatively quiet. This is where there's all this money flowing around, everyone's doing quite well. This is the dynamic we see later in Aceh as well. However, in 2007, the money ran out. You start to see a rise here, and actually I haven't got the most recent years on this chart, but you actually see by 2011 we're up to about here. You also see from 2007 to 2008 is where corruption investigations start to get very active. And this explains the rise here. Okay, so Maluku kind of appears to fit with the theory. How does the theory explain somewhere that is peaceful? Okay, so North Maluku is my peaceful place. In many ways, North Maluku is quite similar to Maluku. In fact, it used to be part of the same province, and there were more people killed in North Maluku than in Maluku, over 3,000 in less than a year. It was the most intense violence of anywhere in Indonesia. So the theory would predict, if we don't see much episodic violence at all, that would mean there's no support from local elites, there's no support from these local violence specialists, and also that there's other opportunities for people to get ahead and do well. And also we would expect that you wouldn't see violence rise whenever resource levels change, because already violence has not become part of the local norms, part of local political currency. So you would expect the society to be quite robust to those changes in resources and in the rules of the game. And argue that that's the case. Okay, so for local elites, argue they don't support violence for two reasons. The first one is that it's not beneficial and that it's costly. A big difference from Maluku is that post-conflict funds were not used to co-opt the elites. You remember in Maluku there was all these projects, money giving out. This was not the case in North Maluku so much, and there's a few reasons for this. The first is that elites had already achieved their goal during the extended conflict. The Maluku conflict was very much about Muslims and Christian leaders trying to win control of the local state in the time of decentralization and so on. In North Maluku it was rather different. The main thing going on was they wanted to get rid of the Sultan of Ternate. The Sultan of Ternate, now, as you know, through the late 90s, there was what people called the rise of Adat, the traditional leaders coming back, becoming more prominent. And there was a lot of political squabbles going on, in particular within Golkar, over who would be the first governor of the new province of North Maluku. And analyses of the North Maluku conflict tend to basically say it started by this elite political competition. The Sultan of Ternate lost. He was banished for a while from North Maluku. He promised he would not stand. However, things then spun out of control as groups used kind of a religious and ethnic narrative and so on. This is a bit different than Maluku. So the elites were successful, and so they didn't have any real advantage of ensuring violence continued. But equally important is that there was no formal peace accord in North Maluku. There were Malino agreements for Central Sulawesi and for Maluku. These were formal peace agreements. In North Maluku, there was no formal peace agreement. After the civil emergency, there were more troops there. They stopped Christian and Muslim areas attacking each other, and everyone was just kind of fed up with the violence. There was conflict fatigue. There had been far more people killed in North Maluku than anywhere else in Indonesia in per capita terms. And essentially what happened instead was that rather than have a peace agreement focused on dividing up funds and jobs, you had these very localized agreements going on, focused on will we let the Christian IDPs come back? Will we let the Muslims return? How are we going to get the local economy going again? How can we open up the market again? These types of things. It was a much more fragmented process. And essentially, this meant that the focus was not really on money. This led to reconciliation, as I say, rather than payoffs. Now, North Maluku actually in the end got almost as much money as Maluku. The Impress 6 2003 also covered North Maluku. However, this money arrived in 2005. The conflict had ended in 2000. At that time, you already had 5 years for these kind of local processes of reconciliation to take place. That was not the case in Ambon, where the conflict ended later and where there was much less time for those processes to take place. So by the time the money arrived, basically elites had already realized that violence is not in our interests. We should move on. There are also more effective security responses to early acts of provocation. North Maluku has never been as important for the military as Maluku. It's kind of a backwards area, right? It's out there, no one really cares about it, right? And basically, when there were some acts to try and sabotage the peace early on, the military and the police took quite effective action and arrested people and stopped things escalating. So essentially that showed that violence would be costly. Also, local leaders who tried to use a kind of anti-Christian or anti-Muslim narrative to get ahead politically, communities didn't like that. There was a guy called Jacob Sosalisa who was a Christian pastor who stood for election in 2004, I guess, on this, Christians, we're strong, we need to battle against the Muslims and so on, and he lost. And that strengthened over time. So again, that sent a signal that using hatred, using violence was not a profitable political strategy. And so the result has been that violence, by and large, has not been a currency of local politics. There's just as much corruption, money politics, very dirty politics going on in North Maluku as Maluku. The difference is they don't turn to violence, by and large, for political purposes. The other reason is that there's more peaceful options available for elites. Let me just focus on a couple of things. One is that essentially elites there collaborate much more. You remember in Maluku, the Christian elites and the Muslim elites very rarely work together. In North Maluku, ethnicity is actually more important than religion in politics. And because the ethnic groups are all quite small, they need to collaborate. So you actually find Christians and Muslims collaborating politically. Very different in Maluku. The second thing is that essentially Pembangunan, the formation of new districts, has provided new opportunities there. North Halmahera, which was the epicenter of the violence, used to be a kecamatan, became a district. And in fact, its budget went up within the first 4 or 5 years to about $160 million, I think. And essentially that created a lot of jobs, a big boom in the local economy. And basically, local elites got focused on politics, right? You know, they wanted to get ahead, to win office. You know, it distracted them, basically, from the old conflict from before. There was also Pembangunan and Maluku. The difference is that it didn't happen in the areas that had been the highest conflict. So Ambon and Central Maluku were the two districts that had the largest number of people killed. Neither of those areas, both of those areas were already districts. In fact, Central Maluku was split up, so the size of the budget of Central Maluku actually went down. Whereas in Halmahera, where the violence in North Maluku was concentrated, there were these new districts. Okay, so that's the local elite side of things. The local violence specialists, again, there hasn't been much support for violence from these groups. One reason is that, in contrast to Maluku, the old militia, the old Preman groups have disbanded. Now, you still have Preman in Ternate and in Halmahera, but they're not the same organizations as were active during the extended violence. And the reason is, most of the groups in North Maluku that got together during the extended violence, their main purpose was to protect their community, not to profit economically. So once the violence was over, they disbanded. They went back to their villages. And so basically that means that you don't have these organizational groups that can be easily mobilized for violence. Likewise, there's been less tolerance of violence by security agencies in North Maluku. I think the main reason for this is that the military and police don't need the excuse of violence in order to profit in North Maluku. The main reason is there's a lot of natural resource wealth in North Maluku. And the military and the police get payments from the mines to be there. And they don't need to have incidents of violence occurring to legitimize them being there. In other words, it's kind of a peaceful equilibrium whereby they are benefiting without the use of violence, which is different in Maluku, where actually ongoing violence is in the interests of local police and military to justify being there. Okay, so on to my third buildings. Actually, I hope you're not too bored yet. So Aceh, as you'll remember, is different than the other provinces because it has a lot of violence, but low levels of large-scale violence, high levels of small violence. And what our theory would predict is that we wouldn't see large support for large episodic violence by local elites. If you remember, just go here again, if you remember, large violence, large episodic violence requires the support of just local elites and also local violence specialists. Where local elites do not support violence, you end up here, small episodic violence. Okay? So we would predict that there would be no support by local elites, but there would be support for small episodic violence by local violence specialists. And again, we would predict that this violence was not a result of hatred or trauma or the state being very weak, but actually support for violence by local violence specialists is a result of them actually benefiting, of it being a useful strategy for accumulation. Okay. Why local elites don't support large episodic violence? The main reason, I think, is because there are other channels available for them to get ahead. The peace agreement in Aceh resulted in two major ways in which local elites did well. The first was it resulted in massive special autonomy funds. Now, this was not part of the peace agreement, but it was part of the law on governing Aceh that was approved by the DPR at the end of the year, which overall is leading to about $10 billion US to Aceh over 25 years. This is extra money from the general allocation of the debt. Yeah? And sorry, there is a graph that shows trends over time, but it's not come out here. And essentially, what you see is if you look at the provincial budget in Aceh, it just goes like this, straight up, right? So you have all the tsunami money going down, but actually the extra local government money has more than compensated for all this special, all the tsunami reconstruction funds. And that's basically increased the incentives for people to participate politically, in particular Ghana. The other major effect of the peace agreement was that it allowed for political opportunities for local elites, in particular Ghana leaders, to take part in local politics. The Helsinki MOU allowed, first of all, for independent candidates to stand in Indonesia, which at the time was unique to Aceh. That's since changed since the Constitutional Court ruling of 2007. But at the time, it meant that former combatant leaders could stand in local elections. And indeed, in late 2006, a former Ghana leader became the governor. Wande Yusuf became the governor of Aceh, and they won about half of the Bupati and Wali Kota's seats as well in the province. It then allowed GAM to form their own local party, Partai Aceh. And what you've seen over time is that basically Partai Aceh have won almost complete control in Aceh, which is a bit worrying, but that's the subject of another talk. So essentially, this has created buy-in to peace for both GAM and others. The vast money has provided all these contracting opportunities, all this use of local state budget for personal enrichment, for patronage as well. And so basically, it's managed to buy off GAM and get them committed to the peace agreement. However, importantly, other elites outside of GAM have also benefited. GAM have been quite pragmatic. They've actually, and this is very interesting, but we think of GAM and the military as being enemies. But actually, in post-conflict Aceh, they collaborate very much. They run projects together. You have people like Sunarko, the former military head, who is actually part of the team success for Partai Aceh before, and all these strange dynamics going on, which actually are not that strange if you look at the history of the conflict, where there was a lot of collaboration between both sides. You had the military selling GAM guns, you had Governor Pute buying satellite telephones for GAM leaders, and again, the subject of another talk. So essentially, you have all these elites working pragmatically and benefiting from this money. And importantly, Morocco, there was a lot of money as well. But the money here is not directly being given to buy off people. It's indirectly buying off people, right? That people access this money through political competition. And that's the difference with Morocco, right? Where it's handed out rather than through political competition. So this has meant that basically local elites are pretty happy with the status quo, and they actually don't want large incidents of violence to happen, because these incidents could have a threat to the peace process, which is actually being very beneficial for these groups. This has also resulted in high costs for those who have tried to use violence. So there hasn't been many large incidents of violence, but one of the big ones was in a place called Atolintang, which is in central Aceh, where essentially you had militia attack the local headquarters of KPA, which is the former GAM organization there, and there were five people killed there. This was in March 2008. Now this could have spiraled out of control. Actually in 2003, during the last peace process, a similar attacks in central Aceh led to the collapse of the peace agreement. But what's different here is that you saw very rapid responses from the military and from the police. Within 2 weeks, there were 25 people arrested. And you also had GAM leaders basically stopping former GAM combatants from taking revenge. You had a signal sent down from the military in Jakarta through the military structure to the local militia group saying this is not going to be tolerated. And there hasn't been any more cases like this. So it's been pretty clear that the benefits of violence are quite low and the costs are high. However, we see a lot of small-scale violence in Aceh. And the reason for this is while local elites don't support violence, local violence specialists do. And here I'm talking about lower-level former combatants. The reason again is that there's few other peaceful opportunities for many of these guys to get ahead. There was a lot of disappointment with the DDR, the reintegration programs for combatants. As part of the peace agreement, there were special programs for former combatants, for political prisoners, and for conflict-affected communities, both government programs and also from donors like the World Bank and the UN and IOM and so on. And basically, this money was not very productive. It got spread around very widely. A lot of the former combatants I spoke to when I was up in Aceh at that time was saying, why are you giving us one rock-up? Just a little bit of smoking money to help us out. This is not going to help us. And what you've seen is that as GAM leaders have got richer and richer, the money has not trickled down to many of the local level guys. And they get disappointed. During the war, there was not a lot of inequality between the GAM leaders and the foot soldiers. Over time, the GAM leaders now drive SUVs, they go off to Kuala Lumpur for medical checks, they go shopping in Singapore, whereas a lot of these guys at the kecamatan level and below are not doing that well. Now, some of them benefit from contracts, working on contracts, but a lot of them have much bigger ambitions than that. They fought for many years and they think, yeah, we want to be a businessman, we want to be, but they don't have the education or the skills or the capital to do that. And so there's this rise in frustration. And basically within this context, using violence proves to be an effective way for them to try and get ahead. And it's effective sometimes for two reasons. One is the direct reason. Through violent crime, you get a direct benefit, right? You steal money from someone, you kidnap someone, you can actually get money. And this has been very, very common dynamic, in particular on the East Coast, in Aceh Timur and Aceh Utara and Barron, places like that. The other thing is that it can send a signal upwards to their former leaders, don't forget about us. And you see there's been a spate of attacks on former GAM leaders' houses and offices. Most of them when the people have been out, so they're not trying to kill them, but they're trying to send a message. We're still here, we're still strong. Send some more money down. It's not been costly, this violence, because both GAM leaders and also security officials have by and large accepted it. The reasons are that GAM leaders have realized, and in confidential interviews with some of them, they've told me this directly, that we've got to let the little guys let off some steam, They know that, they're taking a lot of the money. They've got to let these guys let off some steam and get a little bit, right? Otherwise, things could be much worse. on the part of the police and the military, they've been very cautious about taking actions against former combatants because they're worried it might have a negative effect on the peace process. So they're saying, look, by and large, okay, this is just small-scale stuff. You know, if it's big stuff, okay, we'll step in, but small-scale stuff we won't. Remember, the police and military are not necessarily trusted very much by Achinese. So because of this, it's been logical, rational for many of these former combatants to use violence. Okay, finally, if we move to the national picture. My first two puzzles were explaining variation in post-conflict violence. But an important thing is, why are we not seeing the types of violence we saw around the turn of the century now in Indonesia? There's a lot of violence across Indonesia, but we don't see violent conflicts that are killing thousands of people. Now, Papua is a slight exception, but even in Papua, the number of people dying is much, much lower than it was in any of these places at the height of the violence. And actually, less than 50% of the deaths from violence in Papua are from separatist violence. A lot of it is tribal stuff, it's battles over resource, political conflicts, and so on. So you're not seeing these large-scale extended violent conflicts anymore. And what we would predict from the theory is that, first of all, the reason why these extended violent conflicts occurred in the first place was not just because of local motivations, but also because of the actions of members of the central state. So again, to get up here to extended violence, sure, you need support from local guys, from local elites, and in fact a lot of the literature from Jerry Van Lincoln and Bertrand and Snell focuses very much on why groups at this level have motivations to use violence. And they're correct. However, I argue that the missing dimension here is the central state. Now the reason is, if you're in Somalia or Sudan or DRC, you don't have a bureaucracy and a state that has reached to the local level. So you can have civil war going on in some area and the central government can do nothing about it because it's not strong, it's not a strong state. That's not Indonesia, and that was not Indonesia 15 years ago. In Indonesia, you have military stationed inside every village in Indonesia pretty much. You have the government offices right down to the village level. Indonesia is not a weak state. And so essentially, to get to here, there needed to be acts either of deliberate provocation or the central state just not performing its role properly. Because otherwise, I argue, they could have gone in and they could have stopped this stuff spinning out of control. So we would predict it would be incentives through national elites to support violence, and that these have changed over time. So if we look at the two different periods of Indonesia's democratic transition, the first, and these are very, very rough time points, so 98 to 2004, you could maybe say to 2002, 2003 to make it open. But basically, this was a period where there were unclear rules of the game, where you had 30 years of authoritarian government. Suddenly, you had referendacy, and people didn't know, national elites in Jakarta didn't know what that meant. And in particular, the military didn't know what that meant. They had been a real bulwark of order during the New Order regime, and suddenly you started to have pressures for military reform. You had reductions and eventual removal of their seats in the parliament. You had the end of the official doctrine of free function, of the dual function, which legitimated a political and social role for the military. You had Timor, where there were some responses to basically sanctioning Wiranto in particular. He lost his job over military actions in Timor. And so in this environment, violence was a natural thing for members of the military and some other political elites, because basically it strengthened the military's hands. Allowing these violent conflicts to occur in some areas of the country basically led to claims that we need a strong military if Indonesia is not going to completely disintegrate. And many of you will remember the discourse around 2000, 2001, 99. You know, is Indonesia going to be like Bosnia? Is it going to, the balkanization thesis that Indonesia is going to collapse? And in this environment, you actually see political opinion polls showing increasing support for a stronger military. And again, I don't have time to get into the evidence, but there's quite a bit of evidence of military, in particular in Maluku and Aceh, of actually sowing the seeds of violence. You had the military training Laskar Jihad militia just outside Jakarta, and then sending off 3,000 of them in boats from Surabaya, and then giving them guns in Ambon. And there's other cases as well of the military actively stoking violence. So essentially, you know, this was a strategy during this time of uncertainty to ensure that benefits and privileges from the past were retained by the military and some political elites. However, this has changed over time. If you look at the three main causal variables I've discussed, the benefits, the costs, and the opportunities, I argue that there's been changes in all of these, in particular since SBY came. It partly started when Mega was in power, but in particular since SBY came in. And I think there's been two main dynamics going on here. One has been that Indonesia is now a stronger institutional polity than it was 10 years ago. In fact, I would say that it was during the Suharto years as well. You now have more checks and balances at the central level, things like the Constitutional Court, the direct election of presidents, which actually serve to minimize the ability of local elites to play politics, to use violence for political purposes. You also have had a strategy where power has been dispersed very widely across the political elite, the rainbow coalitions. We can criticize SBY in many ways, and also members of the parliament, for not really making a lot of progress on the reform agenda. But the lack of progress there has actually led to some degree of stability. Because what's happened is you've had almost all elites, basically every party, with the exception of PDIP to some extent, being in cabinet. You've had a deliberate strategy not to push too hard on further military reform. And that, in the context of a growing economy, has meant that basically people accept as rules of the game where violence is not necessary because the national elites are all anything. Now, how does that's a bit abstract, how does that actually affect levels of violence? In this graph here, which is I think a final page, don't call it like that. This blue line here is the number of riots and group clashes in Indonesia over time. So you see big spikes here when the extended violence were going on, and then after Aceh ends, it's been lower, although rising in recent years. However, actually these lines here are more important. This is incidents where there was an intervention by the police or the military when the incident happened. And actually, it doesn't look that steep just because of the scale on the graph. But you find that the number of interventions to riots and group clashes by the police and military has increased massively. In 2004, the police or military only intervened in 3% of riots and group clashes. By 2005, that had risen to 17%. From 2010 to 2012, they're now intervening in more than 50% of riots or group clashes. This means that these things, they're happening, you're having violence, but they're not escalating further. And there's been a lot of examples recently whereby you've had special troops sent in when there's been incidents of violence. So like in Tarakan in East Kalimantan, there was one big case where there was a very large riot a couple of years ago where basically within a day you had Brewall and other special forces in there managing to calm things down. Not only has there been more intervention, but levels of success have gone up as well. In 2006, 63% of the cases where there was an intervention, the intervention was successful, i.e. the violence stopped. By 2012, that figure is up to 88%. So what I'm arguing is that essentially this kind of elite deal at the centre has allowed for a more effective deployment of security forces to stop violence escalating to a high level. They still allow large episodic and small episodic violence to occur, and there's weaknesses of prevention, and I'm not arguing that the police are wonderful in Indonesia now, but the state has been able to get its act together to stop the escalation to large-scale violence. Okay, so just some last points, which I'll keep brief because maybe we can discuss these a bit. As you've seen, my model and theory of post-conflict violence is not based on societal hatreds or the state being weak, but on interests, on the political economy of violence, on the different conditions under which different groups have incentives to use violence for purposes of political and economic accumulation. You also see that addressing different types of violence requires focusing at different levels on different groups. The most important thing for stopping violence to escalate to extended violence is at the central state level. The most important thing. Now, the local factors matter, but those local factors are not sufficient by themselves to allow extended violence to occur. Likewise, if we're wanting to stop riots, group clashes, large-scale violent incidents, the most important focus has got to be on local elites. It's got to be on finding ways to stop them having the incentives or the ability to allow these acts to occur. And for smaller scale violence, we're talking about gangs, community members, and so on. How do we start to think about how we deal with these things? Well, I've provided a kind of analytic lens about how we might do that. The main thing is we need to make violence less beneficial and more costly. I talked at the beginning about the importance of signals, how responses to acts of violence send a signal to other people that violence is either accepted or not, that it's useful or that it's not. And this is a worrying thing in Indonesia now, where we find the state and local leaders often succumbing to the threats of violence by others. You see this through actions of FKP and other radical groups, through church burnings, Ahmadiyya stuff, and so on. This is a worrying dynamic where I think the logic of this political conflict management strategy in Indonesia has been very much about co-optation, about trying to give people stuff to keep them quiet. What I've shown is that that can have a negative externality whereby it starts to send this signal effect. And we need to provide more peaceful opportunities as well, at every level. At the community level, that means jobs, that means more equitable economic development. Indonesia is growing, but inequality levels are growing as well. This is going to be a big focus. Development, employment, and also finding ways to channel competition and conflict through political routes rather than extra political channels. So thank you very much for listening to me. I have some time for discussion now.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. So we will open for discussions. Please mention your name and institutions for those who are asking questions.
Just sorry. At the beginning of your talk, you're saying that after the local communities were active, but the army is left. For what reason? If I'm not mistaken, I think some staff died, and then the army, the day after it was left. For what reason?
The Ambon case?
Yeah,
I discussed at the beginning. Okay, so I don't have strong evidence here. I can only lay out some hypotheses. The first is that it was in the interests of the army and the police to allow conflict to occur. Now, I can't say that's the case. There's been a couple of ICG reports that have hinted at this. At the time, there was a report released by Kajian just before, saying that FKP troops, non-organic troops, should be withdrawn from Maluku, and apparently some planning was in place for that. And one logical possibility is that they allow the violence to occur. Now, the other possibility is just that they're useless, just that they have no capacity, and there might be elements of that as well. But certainly the possibility is there that they deliberately allow violence to occur. The chief of the Maluku and the Amon case got moved on after that. So if it was a strategic move, it wasn't very peaceful move.
Okay, next we will have 3 questions. Emily, first Christine.
Yes, my name is Jenny from SMERU.
Very good presentation, very interesting presentation. I can't think of the reaction of Indonesian politicians and also observers that they got the result of your presentation. But I have a question. It has been discussed that the main cause also underlying behind all those conflicts is the different actors at different levels, and especially at the central level. Well, I was wondering, did you go further to study on that level, the conflicting or the competing elite groups that have been playing and fooling around with people when they were talking about the religious hatred and something like that? Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. I would like to say is really appreciate and this is quite interesting because sorry. Thank you. I have some questions. First of all, that on the approach that you use, you mentioned that you're using local media as a main source. I remember some years ago I read a book, particularly containing about the media and local conflict in Maluku, and the writer mentions about that some local really took a very big role in fueling the conflict. So how you select those media in in collecting the data to make sure that there is not any other bias in the study? That's the first. And the second one is that I remember 2001. I was in Tanimbar in Samlaki, Southeast Maluku, and then it was after 1 year the conflict in Maluku, and then at that time when I asked the local leader about why the conflict, the social conflict, didn't spread to or massively to the southeast, and then they say that mostly because the local leaders firstly anticipated and tried to control the people, and then they also had local approach that they always make sure the people that family relationship is stronger than religious relationship. So that makes them not to be mostly impacted by the conflict in Maluku. So what is your opinion about that areas which is a little bit different from Maluku, particularly Northern Ambon, rather than Southeast Maluku? And the last one is that I also remember one of the writers once wrote about the situation in Indonesia. He criticized that the way that the government handled the conflict seems to be emphasized more on he used the term peaceful coexistence rather than creative pro-existence. Meaning to say that pro-existent creative pro-existent means that how the governments to be the leader or to be the one that would try to make the people not only to be not to disturb each other but to be peaceful, but on on the not to disturb each other. So that's what he said, peaceful coexistence. Yeah, that's it. So what do you think about, what is your comment? That's it. Thank you.
Jim Bell-Jackman from the International Crisis Group, had a fascinating talk. But I just want to pick up on the comment made right at the end there that's not in your presentation about the police chief and the military chief in Ambon losing their jobs. Indonesia is often criticized for having no accountability in violence, but I think we do see accountability in recent years. It's weak, but if you go and look at the Lampung violence in October, the police chief was moved on. He didn't get the job as Kapolda Jawa Barat, which would have been very profitable, but he went off to the police school. If you look at the Cipinong case, which is a different type of violence recently, both the Pangkang Diponegoro and the Kapolda Jogja lost their jobs. I'm interested, and you're talking about incentives against, the making violence costly for national elites. I'm interested to sort of see whether you think losing your job is a cost for senior officials, particularly security officials. And your insights historically, I was off between 1999 and 2009 in a different part of the world, but is this a new thing? If you go back into 98 to 2002, were senior officials losing their jobs, particularly security officials losing their jobs for violent outbreaks on their turf? Or is this sort of accountability a more recent thing, perhaps, that's come with stability, relative stability of the administration, basically? Thank you.
Thanks. Great questions, all of them. Ling? Yeah, I'll be interested to see what politicians have to make sure I have a good visa before I release any of this stuff. On the central state level, in my thesis I get into this a bit more. I actually think in terms of what I'm saying in the thesis, this is at least new, the national state level stuff. I rely primarily on secondary sources. There's been a lot written on this stuff. I think a lot of this relates to intra-military politics, and so I discuss quite a bit of that in the chapter of my thesis that focuses on that, related to the competition between the reformers and initially pro-rental and then reformers and others. And I don't really want to get too much into the details, but I'll certainly send you the chapter, in particular if you provide comments on it. The fresh material that I collected is primarily the local level stuff, which is where I did extensive field work. 3 questions from the second commentator. On the local media stuff, yeah, you're right. There was a lot of biases, and just want to make it clear what I'm using the newspapers for. I'm not using them to say anything about causality, about who caused the conflict, about who was to blame, about what we use the newspaper data for is how many people were killed in what areas. Now, there were some inaccuracies there, but I think those were less than, you know, a Muslim newspaper said it was the Christians' fault, or the Christians said it was the Muslims' fault. As part of the database, we used multiple, I'm not sure how many from local, but probably 7 or 8 newspapers. Triangulation went with more conservative estimates, cross-checked with academic studies and policy papers, spoke to local experts. So we had many processes of triangulation. I think studies that rely on local newspapers to explain what exactly happens, there's a lot of problems with that. I'm just using that to actually show patterns of people killed and so on. On Southeast Morocco, I haven't been there, I didn't study there. Within each province, I focused on 2 districts. So I went to Central Morocco and Ambon in Morocco, which were the epicenters of the conflict. Your argument would be consistent with my theory, right? Which is, for extended violence to occur, you need the support of 3 groups: central state elites, local elites, and local communities or local violence specialists. So even if you have certain elements of the central state trying to sow the seeds of violence, if you have local leaders and community members having mechanisms to stop that, the violence will not escalate. The central state is not omnipotent, because at each level it requires acquiescence from the level below for violence to occur. On the last point, I guess, I forget the terms you used, but I think your point is, are people just kind of getting on with each other, or is it a more proactive, transformational change? And you know, I think that's right in the medium to long-term agenda. I've talked about incentives, although that's been my focus, right? But people, someone's incentives is it's a cognitive decision. It's the way they see the world, right? And you need education and deeper structural changes that start to get people to think, look, even if I can benefit from using violence, maybe that's not a good thing to do. So this will certainly be a challenge for Indonesia, as everywhere, about how you start to build greater awareness so that it's not just groups kind of getting by with each other, but actually see themselves as one and the same, right? As Indonesians, or whatever ethnic or religious group they come from. On the comments from Jim on kind of the accountability mechanisms and the police and so on, just losing your job, is that a cost? Of course it is, yeah. And basically, I think the reason a lot of these local acts of violence have occurred, these large local acts of violence have occurred, is because local leaders and sometimes security officials, it's been unclear what the message is from above, right? They don't know how far they can get away with, right? So in Ambon, for example, maybe the local, again, this is hypothesis, right? I don't have strong evidence, but maybe the local police chief, they think, oh, this is a clever way for us to stop, you know, getting people out and so on. What they don't realize is they've actually kind of overstepped the mark and then they lose their job. And I think in the Lampung cases, absolutely that sends a strong signal. A lot of my argument is about the importance of strong signals for changing behaviour. However, this does not happen in every case, right? I mean, it was only because the Lampung stuff got so much press in the national press that really the pressure, I think, was put on to clamp down. And so, in fact, I think one of your analysts actually wrote a piece about this recently about how, you know, under certain conditions, accountability from civil society can actually lead to state responses to these things. But it's not uniform, right? Because most of the time, if you have a riot somewhere, okay, Lampung is quite near to, it's basically West Java almost, right? So it's quite near the centre of Indonesia. But if you've got some little riot somewhere out in the far reaches, I think if it's not going to spin out of control, by and large the central state doesn't care that much, most of the time. right? It's where there appears to be the prospect of things spinning out of control that then they really step in. So certainly I think, you know, it is an important accountability mechanism, sacking or removing all the local police chief. And I think that's different in the early period. By and large, in Magoku the commanders were changed from time to time, but they didn't, you know, they did go to other positions that were lower down when they failed to manage the conflict. And I think that a lot of that was because there was little pressure put on the military and the police leaders in Jakarta at that point to sanction individuals within their organizations. The main reason being that Habibie and Wahid, to a lesser extent Bega, were still dependent on military support in order to stay in prisons.
Next question.
I'm interested with your methodology. Political economy is an interesting angle to study a topic, yet it is not easy to study. If you can share with us, because also conflict is a sensitive issue, if you can share with us how did you collect the information, how did you find the key informants, and how you convince them to speak freely and trust you, will be very useful for us.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. My name is Pia. I'm working for the Ministry of Planning, for the Directorate for Political Affairs and Communications. I have two questions, but my first question is, I think, related to methodology also. Besides, I wanted to confirm whether, other than the set of data you get from the World Bank project, is that the one conducted by the Habibie Center? Is it?
Beyond the violence monitoring system, Habibie Center is part of the project, yeah.
Okay.
Then Kestra and a group called JRI just a different collection.
Alright, so other than that, whether did you do direct observation on the field, or did you do any interviews with the resource persons? My second question is, I see from the implications that you've written in your presentation that you put emphasis on several things, but I didn't see if you suggest for more dialogue, conducting dialogues. I want you to share your opinion on how do you see the role of dialogue that actually has been initiated by the government, because like the Ministry of Home Affairs, they have certain programs on facilitating dialogues in particular post-conflict areas using the various forums like FKUB, FKDM, or FPK, if you have heard of them, probably, in relation to your implications. I know this forum has been highly criticized for being not so effective to solve the problem, but I want you to share your opinion on this. And in relation to the second question, do you have any suggestion on how to improve the role of these forums in addressing the conflict? I conclude that from your implication, the government really have to do different approaches to different conflicts in different areas. But if you may have a suggestion on this issue, thank you.
Can I just jump in?
Yes.
Very close relation to the mentioned by colleagues from Pembangunan. You mentioned as well on one of the cases kind of zero-sum game. This is very, in these cases, the situation is coming for the society itself. kind of, in war situation anytime, any step, or even in the ambit of university, for example, there's, can you, I don't know whether, what kind of background they are doing such kind of behavior. That's one thing. And also in relation with your West Kalimantan, between Madura and Daya, is that to some extent the same zero-sum situation or what? And how we approach this kind of society? Thank you very much. Kumar from Urban Studies.
Okay. Okay, on the method stuff. Yeah, I did direct field observation. So overall, I spent about a month in each province. Aceh I've been working on for much of the last 5 or 6 years, so I also relied on kind of past research I've done there. It is difficult to get information on these things, and I think I was really fortunate to work with a bunch of other researchers in collecting this data who often had good connections and trust. So in Maluku, I did a lot of my field work with Neji Vaska from UAM, who wrote his PhD dissertation on former jihadis in Mosul and Maluku, and has a decade of experience working there. Also worked with local guys like Abidin Wakano and Jackie Manabuti, who are respected civil society leaders who have access. And we strategically use your bullets, right? So sometimes it's helpful being a foreigner, and sometimes it's not. And that's whatever your identity. That's part of sometimes I would be a World Bank researcher, sometimes I would be an Oxford researcher. There's different ways, and that's part of being a good researcher on anything, is to try and judge that. I've also been researching conflict for many years, right? So I've got some ideas of how you can sensitively ask people. But I also find out in the region, people are often very open, yeah? And they tell you a lot, and the important thing then is how do you verify it, right? So, basically, when I did 2 different things in my field research. One was, first of all, I came up with a bunch of hypotheses on what might be the causes of post-conflict violence, mainly based on the international literature, right? I then went and spoke to people and tried to not formally test, but get a sense, does this make sense here, or is this completely irrelevant, right? There's a lot of stupid stuff in the literature as well, right? But, so I did that. At the same time, I tried to pick cases of incidents of conflict that had become violent, or incidents of conflict where they managed to stop violence. And I did kind of process tracing of that, right? So I asked people about what happened, who was involved, and created case chronologies of that, and used that to try and actually make more concrete links between the factors I was hypothesizing as driving violence and actually show this was playing out in real ways. So, an example, the corruption stuff, right? So, okay, a lot of people would tell me that riot was because it was a corruption investigation. But how do I know that's actually the case? What I tried to do was I actually tried to take 2 or 3 cases and map them through and actually look at how this dynamic played out in producing a specific incident of violence. But it's difficult, right? In a lot of places, I can't say for certain I'm right. I just you put the evidence out there, and like a lawyer, you try and use the evidence to make an argument, and let readers judge what they think of it. On the 2 questions on the dialogues, what did I think about dialogues? I don't think that should be the cornerstone of the government's response to conflict. I think people act violently because they have interest to, and sitting in a room talking about peace most of the time is not going to change people's interests. Now that's not to say that there's not a role for them, right? I mean, I think there is. I mean, I didn't discuss like the Ambon riots in 2011. One of the reasons, there was 2 reasons why they didn't escalate further. One was that the Gordon Minister for Security went there, the military went there, the chief went there, the Panglima police went there, and they, you know, they got their act together. The other reason was it was great stuff from civil society movements there, like Jackie and Abedin, who I discussed before, who really had been, you know, working with civil society groups to try and build better relations and understanding. So that stuff is important when it's done well. But let's not kid ourselves to think that getting people in the room is going to take away all the incentives that people have for violence. And I think what the government needs to do more is actually just to act by its own rules more. You know, actually, if someone commits violence, prosecute them. If people don't succumb to threats of violence, a lot of my argument is about the inadvertent impacts of just single things. And I actually think that's much more important than any specific peace building type project. At the same time, I talked about the lack of opportunities in some of these areas and how that creates incentives for grey man and stuff to use violence. And so there's also stuff to be done about Ambon, dealing with the segregation there, getting the IDPs back home, trying to find ways to employ young men. So that these are very legitimate things that the government should and is doing in some cases. But the focus solely on traditional peace building type stuff like dialogues is not going to be the answer to these problems. FKP being an example, right? That's the only one that I know anything about, just from Moloko and North Moloko. FKP is a state-mandated institution. The main roles it plays are, number 1, improving houses of worship, new mosques or churches. Number 2, acting as a patronage vehicle for local politicians. As a way, there's been some work done by Dirk Thompson, an academic in one of the Israeli universities on local politics there. And actually it's very ineffective. So I don't think those things are transformational. On the last question, I didn't quite get it all right, but West Kalimantan, I mean, I haven't studied West Kalimantan. I chose to focus on 3 provinces because it was hard enough getting good information in 3 provinces. There has been a bit written about the book there, about politics, about Jimmy Davidson's work and other things written on the extended violence and why there might be political reasons to displace the Meadows and so on. I have absolutely no idea what's going on in the last 10 years. I've never been to West Kalimantan. Interesting.
Okay.
Thank you, Teddy. I also find your interesting, especially since you put the conflict and violence in Indonesia in the context of decentralization and democratization, and even in corruption eradications. I think the story you told makes sense. I'm intrigued with the role of the security because on the one hand it can play the role as the suppressant factor of conflict, and it can make the cost of conflict high to the actors. But on the other hand, they can play as the inciter, or even they can create conflicts. And in context decentralizations, the police in Indonesia is not decentralized, so they are part of the central level. I'm wondering, had the police been decentralized in the beginning, would the situation lead to more or less conflict? Perhaps the literatures or international experience can tell us a bit about it. Thank you.
More questions? Yeah, from the back.
you.
I'm Suarez from Indonesia Defense University. I just want to know whether you include Papua in your data, because I cannot confirm whether it is included in Indonesia-wide law or not. And then I'm just curious whether the theories and the implications derived from this study can also be applied to, like say, the ongoing extended violence, like say in Papua, or should we limit this theory and its implications to the post-conflict case? Thank you.
Congratulations, Betty. Your presentation is very interesting and useful for my work as well. My name is Maya from UNDP. Your presentation actually gives me, or your findings gives me an impression that about the perpetrators or the actors of conflict, that it is due to the distribution of power and the distribution of power and resources that they are fighting over, and it is the community that that suffered. But I'm wondering, from your travel from these three provinces, from your findings, whether does the civil society or the people, the local communities, do they have the capacity to prevent the conflict, the violent conflict to happen, even that there is this interest of power or resources among these three types of people, three types of groups that you mentioned? My second question, my other question is, I hope that you are aware that there is this law number 7 enacted in last year, in 2012, the law on social conflict management. Whether do you think that from your findings in these three provinces, whether this law is a response to the current situation? As far as I know, that now they are producing the related ministries are now drafting the FKP, the draft national regulation to operationalize this law. So do you think that this is a useful response to the current situation in the country? Thank you.
Oh, these are all really good questions. Awesome. The question is very, very difficult for me. You're right that there's positive and negative roles of violence as a product both of lack of effective policing or military force, and at times has been a product of active instigation of violence by the police and military at different points of time in different places in Indonesia. Would having a more decentralized police force have allowed for these problems to be dealt with? Personally, I think it would raise more risks than progress. The main reason being that it would be easier for local elites to do deals with local police officers for their own purposes. Which I think is, so I mean, the pros of that is, okay, well, maybe have an increased ability for the police to respond quickly in effective ways, but as I understand, they already do, right? So, I mean, they already do have the scope to deploy quickly anyway. Of course, I think decentralizing security further has its dangers. I think, you know, my presentation has talked a lot about the negative sides of the police and military, but also, you know, responding to Jim's questions as well, there has been some positive sides. the question is the next stage of improving the capacity and reforms within the police and military to be more effective. And I think the main thing there is sorting out the financing and the accountability mechanisms, right? It's, you know, you've still got a lot of the budget generated from off-budget resources, which is the case now. You've got the local police and military as a local economic player that creates all kinds of disparate incentives for them not to do their main job properly, which is providing security. The second is this accountability thing of holding local chiefs to account, of which there's been some positive signs, but it's by no means universal. On Papua, the Papua data, the quantitative data, we have it. I think if you read the Habibi Center puts out 6 monthly briefs on this, and it reports on that stuff. And Papua at the moment has the highest levels of violence in Indonesia. I haven't included it in the study because my study is of what happens after large-scale conflicts end. And you can either see Papua not as a large-scale conflict, there's some arguments for that, or you could say that it's a large-scale conflict, but it's still ongoing. So that's the reason why I haven't focused on Papua. Do the ideas apply to Papua? Maybe, yeah. I mean, maybe conflict there is not only about separatist identity, but it's also driven in part by the incentives that all kinds of different groups have to use violence for their own purposes. I'm not saying that's the. I don't want to sound like an economist here. You know, identity matters and these types of things are important as well. But it may be a useful framework for people working on Papua to start to think about what are these local kind of political economy incentives, also at the national level, what is driving the ways in which the state is responding to Papua. I don't know enough about the conflict there, so. But I think at least it's a lens to think about things that would be useful. And Maya's, Maya, the two questions on, first of all, about do local communities have the power to prevent violence? Yeah, but only to a certain level. So local communities and formal institutions manage themselves very well most of the time, right? What the problem is that there's a limit to the extent to which local social capital and cohesion can be robust in the face of very large pressures from outside. And I think you see that in Morocco, right? They actually had these traditions of Hela and stuff where different ethnic and religious groups would interact and so on, but it just got overwhelmed by the master narrative of violence that was driving things. Again, that's it's another study, right? Is how do you build that local social cohesion? And I think that's an important agenda as well. But I focus a bit more on how do you limit those external forces. On the law, I don't have any comment because I haven't read the latest law. I mean, I remember when we were in the process of drafting, but I actually don't know how it ended up. So actually, I'd love to have a chat with you about that and see what's in there.
Thank you. I think we have reached the time. Oh, one more question? One more round, Pak Asad. Anyone? Any more questions from the floor, from the audience? Okay, we just go through the sessions and try to summarize that since the political economy of violence is very important in preventing or promoting post-conflict violence, I think we have to open up the opportunity politically and economically. It has to be all focusing down to the local level. And big applause to Penny for the and we have some book of appreciations from SMERU given by Pa. lunch together here. Maybe also, because it's a